How and why does Germany systematically silence Palestinian voices? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Hebh Jamal. Hebh Jamal is a Palestinian journalist reporting on anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia in Germany. Her work has appeared in, among other places, Al Jazeera, Plus 972 Magazine, Mondoweiss, and Middle East Eye. Hebh Jamal, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be speaking on this with you.
And I should just add that starting today and for the next 2 weeks, we're doing a number of programs to mark 75th commemoration of the Palestinian Nakba. And I'm very pleased that today is our first installment with you as our guest. So to jump right into it, Germany is generally regarded as a European leader in the censorship and suppression of Palestinian and pro-Palestinian voices. At the general level, how does this campaign operate? Are there specific laws at the federal or regional level criminalizing such speech as inherently anti-Semitic? Is a campaign in response to public or political pressure? Is it implemented through the denial of public funding and facilities normally made available to others? Is it a case of German authorities acquiescing to pressure from Israel and local Zionist activists, or perhaps a combination of the above? I think a very simple and concise and straightforward multi-part question, if you will. But how do you see this campaign operating? What are its sources?
Right. So I think just right off the bat, it's very important to understand that Germany is not the UK, it's not America, it's not other, countries in the West that have Israeli lobbies to push out, Israeli and Zionist narratives within the country to suppress Palestinian voices. Of course, there is smaller, pro-Israel Zionist organizations that do influence some levels, some political level within society, but overwhelmingly, this is coming from Germans themselves. It's coming from German public institutions themselves. And it's important, there are multiple kind of instances that kind of escalated the anti-Palestinian repression in Germany. But the most important ones I think to consider are specifically the adoption by the German state of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which specifically states that anti-Zionism is is also anti-Semitic. So criticism of Israel is also anti-Semitic. And in 2019, the Bundestag resolution, the anti-BDS resolution,
German parliament.
Right, the German parliament's anti-BDS resolution that they have adopted. But it is important also to acknowledge that the anti-BDS resolution is a non-binding document. It is not legal in any sort of instances. Actually, multiple lawyers within the country have proven and have won cases in court that specifically, have targeted Palestinian advocates on the basis of this resolution. And they have won because it's a non-binding, illegal document that they have adopted.
So it's a sense of parliament resolution rather than enforceable legislation.
Right. But what happens is that in every level of society, you have people that are taking it upon themselves to deny Palestinians public space, to deny them the ability to protest, to deny them also public funding. That is what this anti-BDS resolution stated. So it's entirely on a case-by-case scenario. And, a lot of different institutions know that not every Palestinian is going to sue them, right? And so what they're doing is that they're denying them access to public funding, public space. And if you know anything about Germany, that is a very crucial part of society. Everything is essentially publicly funded. There's very little access to private facilities. So this has essentially made Palestinians to just take to the streets. And that's been the case.
And when you say public institutions, I presume you're referring to official government agencies. And by this, are you referring mainly to the German federal government, to its very powerful regional government, municipal government, or a combination of them, or all of them?
I'm so sorry. We have a automatic theater. Just give me one second. I'm so sorry.
Sure.
Okay. Very, very sorry.
No worries.
It's all of the above.
Mhm.
It's truly all of the above, from the very basic level. So I specifically interviewed, for example, students within universities that have been denied funding for a pro-Palestinian club. That is the level in which anti-Palestinian racism operates. I'll go even further, not even universities, within public education classrooms. Within the classroom, students are not able to even say that they're Palestinian in multiple situations. I've interviewed, and by the way, when journalists interview people, it's a very small, it's a very small sample, right? And you know that there's probably hundreds of others. I've interviewed over 50 students within Germany that have specifically told me that they've had a race experience within the classroom with a teacher not able to acknowledge, their own identity and not being able to even talk about it in an unbiased manner. So you're experiencing anti-Palestinian racism among all sorts of, all sections of society. You have anti-Semitism commissioners within every single German federal state, right? So there's 16 states, and there's multiple anti-Semitism commissioners across the country. A majority of them are not Jewish, right? So you have non-Jewish anti-Semitism commissioners that are specifically, being the judge of what is or isn't anti-Semitic. And in more cases than not, the anti-Semitism that they do find is pro-Palestinian solidarity, right? And this is, again, happening all over Germany every day.
You mentioned public funding, and I think perhaps to many viewers in North America or in the UK, it wouldn't be seen as such a big deal. But you indicated that in Germany, it is significant because many similar activities by other organizations or for other causes would be publicly funded.
Right. Yeah, so there are multiple examples of, public institutions taking it upon themselves to not fund events, to limit the fundings of events, to specifically categorize events as anti-Semitic, or even go further to just ban the event from happening to begin with. So that there are multiple cases of this happening, every year. In 2017, there was the, banning of artist Talib Kweli just because, he was supportive of Palestine. In 2019, you also banned, Berlin also banned Rasmi Oda from speaking, just being able to advocate in public. And then recently you have the banning of Roger Waters from Frankfurt.
Right.
To
Well,
have his
let's get into specific examples and the different categories.
Right.
Let's start with, for example, cases that are specifically directed against Palestinians or Arabs expressing solidarity with Palestinians in Germany.
Right, sure. So I think a very important place to start is this, bombshell of, in my opinion, scandal of, the purge of Arab and Palestinian journalists within Deutsche Welle. And Deutsche Welle is a government-funded news agency.
It's a German equivalent of BBC World Service, effectively.
Exactly, right, yes. And, I believe now 2 years ago, Deutsche Welle fired 7 Arab and Palestinian journalists, and on the basis that, they're anti-Semitic. And if you've looked at the investigation, I've looked at the documents, they have included hashtag Save Sheikh Jarrah as evidence of anti-Semitism. They used a map of Palestine that says Free Palestine on a social media post as evidence of anti-Semitism. They've used people's personal social media accounts that have, expressing their own private political views as evidence of anti-Semitism. And what's interesting, to show the amount of, bias that Deutsche Welle had in this investigation, at the head of the investigation, they put a Islamophobic, self-declared Arab Israeli, Ahmed Mansour, to do the investigation himself. Right. And of course, he found several instances of anti-Semitism. But what's interesting is that many of those journalists, I forget the actual number, but they have sued Deutsche Welle for firing
Wrongful dismissal.
unjustly. Exactly. And a lot of them won their cases because Germany has very strong labor laws. And it is very interesting that they are not even taking those labor laws into account. That's the extent that they will go to show that they're pro-Israel, to show that they are pro-Zionism.
And were these journalists reinstated?
I actually not sure. They have, so Deutsche Welle in some of those cases are, they're sorry, I'm forgetting the legal term, but they're
They,
extending.
they settled, or?
No, they did not settle. So they're extending the
Oh, they're
process.
appealing.
Yeah, they're appealing. Sorry, yeah, they don't want to reinstate the journalists themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
And another category is of foreign Palestinian solidarity activists censored in Germany, whether Germans or foreigners visiting Germany. Can you recount some of the cases in this category?
Yeah, so again, I did mention, there have been multiple instances of speakers, pro-Palestinian solidarity speakers that have spoken up on Palestine that have just been banned. They go to a public kind of facility so they could speak, but their events have been banned on the premise that they're anti-Semitic. I mentioned Rasmia Oda in 2019. She was banned from speaking in Berlin. Just, a few weeks ago, Roger Waters was banned from performing in Frankfurt, even though he sued and now he won that case. But there have been tons of examples of this in particular. It does not just, affect Palestinians or Arabs. It also affects anyone that identifies as pro-Palestinian.
And are these cases where people are denied visas to enter Germany, or their actual events are canceled?
So both. So they have done, both in the past. They have been banned from entering Germany, but they're also their events would also be banned. So it definitely depends case by case. But one thing in particular that I would really like to mention that I forgot to, when it comes to, the anti-Palestinian racist examples against Palestinians and Arabs, just last year, and this is very significant, Berlin banned pro-Palestinian demonstrations in Berlin, right? They just said, we don't want any protests in Berlin that, that was supposed to commemorate the Nakba. To go even further than that, even commemorations or vigils for Shireen Abu Akleh, like her murder, they also banned.
Which
And
was
it was
almost precisely a year ago.
Yes, exactly. It was precisely a year ago. We don't even have to go a year ago. Just a few weeks ago, they also banned protests, pro-Palestinian solidarity protests in Berlin and other places in Germany. This is a consistent tactic they have now used. And what's interesting is that they specifically have allowed neo-Nazi protests in Berlin. So it's a complete anti-COVID neo-Nazi, anti-COVID legislation that was organized.
And on what grounds are these demonstrations banned? Is it a
So
threat
they
to public
specifically
order?
say, yeah, exactly. So they say it's a threat to public order. They're anti-Semitic. They have said, they've incited violence in the past. This is what the Berlin police specifically said. But what's interesting is that last year, there was a Middle East Eye article that exposed the Berlin police that specifically said that they were racially profiling. So they arrested 170 people last year during Nakba Day commemorations. And some people were not even going to protests, but they arrested them because they look Palestinian, because they were wearing the keffiyeh, because they had the Palestinian flag. Even if you had a Palestinian flag around you, you were arrested and detained and fined, right? And this, of course, is not just Palestinians and Arabs. It also impacts anti-Zionist Jews as well.
Well, that was going to be my next question. In the UK, for example, we've seen that purges in the UK Labour Party, undertaken under the pretext of rooting out anti-Semitism, have disproportionately targeted Jews, specifically anti-Zionist Jews. Are we seeing a similar phenomenon in Germany, where being Jewish is not a sufficient defense against the charge of anti-Semitism if one is also an anti-Zionist?
Of course, yes, we have seen multiple cases. I can tell you last year again within the Nakba Day commemorations, they banned Jewish organizations that were trying to do a vigil for Shireen Abu Akleh. So the thing that I just mentioned, this was actually organized by Jewish activists. It wasn't even a Palestinian-led event, and it was still banned from taking place. A few weeks ago, maybe even less than a few weeks ago, a Jewish anti-Zionist activist who supports BDS. Her name is Judith Bernstein. She
He's
was
German.
yes, she was sued by a former anti-Semitism commissioner for being anti-Semitic. He's non-Jewish. I mean, like, it's ridiculous the extent in
I think the
which.
scientific term is Kafkaesque.
Right. Yes, exactly. It's the extent in which these, German, non-Jewish people, politicians, political figures will go to show their allegiance to Israel. And in many ways, Germany has become a puppet government for the state of Israel. There is barely any negative coverage of Israel whenever there's an attack on Gaza, whenever there's, injustice happening in Al-Aqsa and Sheikh Jarrah or what have you. It has been consistently pro-Israel, regardless if it's left, if it's right, if it's neutral. It's always pro-Zionism, pro-Israel.
Hebh, you've argued that the German campaign against Palestinian speech is situated within a broader context of anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia in German public life. Can you elaborate on this point?
Of course. So whenever there's anti-Palestinian racism, more often than not, it's also coupled with Islamophobia. We have what is called imported anti-Semitism here in Germany. This is the phrase that is used by, German officials and politicians and people within the media. They do not see, after the Holocaust and this whole kind of assumption that they have atoned for their sins, Germany now believes there's a new phase of anti-Semitism that is being brought into the country from the Middle East.
In other words, anti-Semitism is not the responsibility of German people. It's something that's being artificially inseminated, if you will, into German society by immigrants.
Right. And even when they do mention right-wing right-wing extremists, neo-Nazis, right? Even when they do mention these individuals, Muslims are always, it's always at the end of the sentence that also, there's imported anti-Semitism from people within the Middle East. In official documents, you have, the German state actually describing, quote unquote anti-Semitic verses within the Quran, basically saying that in Islam there's inherent anti-Semitism. This is the extent also of Islamophobia. So once again, it's not just it's not just Palestinians, and it's not even just Arabs. It's people who identify as Muslim. It's also migrants, regardless of their religious background, right? It's all under the same banner. And you find this also in many other cases, kind of like, Islamic extremists. You find this language, wherever it is post 9/11.
And is this also used to, for example, whitewash anti-Semitism and, for example, medieval Christian theology? And I'm thinking specifically of the Lutheran Church, which of course has been dominant in Germany.
Of course, right. So once again, like this rhetoric, it's never internalized. It's always pushed outward, right? Germany has a very serious problem where they believe that they have, they are finished with the era of their dark past. And what's interesting is they do not even acknowledge their colonial past. They don't see the Holocaust as part of their colonial past. They see it as this one singular event. They did wrong and that's it. But they do not want to even acknowledge their own dark history in Africa, for example, the massacres that they did in Africa. They don't believe that that's on the same level, for example. So I believe that, in Germany, once again, to kind of summarize this point, anti-Semitism is imported, right? Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians,
Turkish people kind of all circled are the ones who are exhibiting this phenomenon, and they're kind of innocent of it.
Yeah, because again, to continue on this point, as you pointed out, the discussion would be incomplete without reference to Germany as an instigator and perpetrator of the Nazi Holocaust during the Second World War. And you're making the point or the argument that Germany's censorship of Palestinian speech is, at least in part, a misguided atonement for its past sins, and additionally, an attempt to whitewash contemporary German anti-Semitism, what you referred to as imported anti-Semitism. So how does this operate in practice?
Right. So one thing that I think is important to bring into the conversation, and a lot of academics here in Germany that are aware of the dynamics of this have spoken about it. There's a thing that Germans often refer to a memory culture, their own memory culture of the Holocaust. And they very much consider the Holocaust their own, right? It's their own tragedy to reflect upon, their own sins to reflect upon. And in a very perverse way, they will also criticize anti-Zionist Jews who want to contribute to that conversation, that say, wait, maybe Judaism is not what you're, trying to make it out to be, right? There's a lot of different types of, factors that go into our faith that you can't just define for us, but they ignore this very small section of society. And they will often define that for them. And within their memory culture, Palestinians are this very pesky sort of inconvenience, right? It's something that they cannot just, set aside.
Mhm.
So what they do is they talk about their own atonement. They say, okay, like, we're supporters of Israel. We are on this journey of becoming a world leader again because we support the independent Jewish state. And when Palestinians bring into the conversation saying, wait, hold up, there's atrocities happening in Palestine and Germany is funding it. And I have to also mention this, the attack on Gaza last night and this morning is a tragedy, is a war crime, and it is brutal. Germany is helping brutalize Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, within 48 territories. They are contributing to this brutalization of Palestinians and contributing to apartheid. There are human rights organizations have specifically called Israel an apartheid state, and Germany will not acknowledge that. They will say that this is, this is an anti-Semitic categorization,
Yeah,
right?
well, and that takes me to my next question. The establishment of Israel upon the ruins of Palestine, the Palestinian Nakba, was, of course, in part a consequence of the Nazi Holocaust. Do you see any evidence that Germans, whether at the official or at the public level, are aware of this connection and have sought to take any responsibility for it?
No, no, I don't. I think that in terms of taking responsibility for it, they will always side with, with Israel. They will say that they are the voice of the Jewish people. And as Germans, they dare not kind of contradict that. Even though there are Jewish Germans within their own society that have spoken up against it. But I do want to point out that this is, of course, the German, I want to say the elite, the media institutions, public institutions, political figures, universities, etc. I want to categorize that as the elite because I don't want to believe that the regular German public is blind to what's happening. People have social media, and it's hard to just kind of ignore what is happening on social media. I want to point out that in 2021, during the assault on Gaza, there were thousands of people in the streets of Berlin, thousands. People were stunned by this number. So I don't want to kind of end off by saying that it is pointless in Germany. Otherwise, there's no point in me really talking about it.
Right.
I want to, kind of point out that I believe that the public slowly but surely will understand that there is a very, very serious contradiction happening, and their own country is responsible for the deaths of thousands.
As you're aware, and my final question, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, recently issued this rather horrendous video statement on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of Israel's establishment. She left virtually no Zionist or anti-Palestinian trope unstated, stating that Israel had made the desert bloom, characterizing it as a vibrant democracy and so on, basically everything but congratulating Yitzhak Shamir for inventing a cure for cancer. She was, of course, speaking as the leader of the European Union, but do you also see many of these themes within Germany that we've been discussing as somehow being reflected in the way that she approached the statement and completely excised Israel's Palestinian citizens and indeed the entire Palestinian people with any reference in those remarks?
So I have to say that her statements are pretty much in line with how German officials and again, this German elite has described, Palestine and Palestinians. I could give a very specific example. A few years ago, there was a Nakba exhibition. So it was an art exhibition, just photos of, the Nakba atrocities that took place in a very small, art gallery here in where I live in Mannheim. And the anti-Semitism commissioner specifically, tried to cancel that event and to cancel it from happening, and saying that the Nakba, how this is described is anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, and Palestinians were just left on their own accord. This is, again, think of every Israeli propaganda talking point, and you will find
there.
It's there. Of course, it's there. I can give another example within, that there has been official, documents that have been circulated around for handouts for teachers. So this is created by committees. It's not necessarily a federal education committees, but it very much influences, the education within the federal states. And they have compiled, a list of specific talking points against BDS, right? And the human rights call for Palestinians to return home. They categorize that as anti-Semitic because it denies Israel's right to exist. This is an actual quote from an actual handout that is being sent to teachers in Germany. So once again, it's everywhere. And they have changed German textbooks to reflect it as well. The examples, we'd be speaking forever on it, but in short, yes.
And you've spoken today quite a lot about interviews that you've conducted. Are you ever approached by German media to discuss these issues and to reflect on how Palestinians experience this campaign of systematic silencing and censorship?
No, all of my work has unfortunately been for the international audience, supported by Palestinians within Germany and anti-Zionist Jewish organizations within Germany. But I try to do my best to uplift those on the ground specifically, but no German media has ever contacted me about this work. And what's, interesting, I actually tried to write for a German publication once, was going through and ended up not being published because they wanted to take sections that referred to Palestine out of the article itself. So no, I'm not, consulted on this within the German media. It's very much, unfortunately, right now for the international audience to keep tabs on.
It's a foreign story as far as Germany's concerned, much like their contemporary interpretation of German anti-Semitism.
Of course, and I just like to the kind of like the final thing that I'd like to say is please continue to keep an eye on Palestinians within Germany that are doing the work. Right now, in particular, there are activists who are planning demonstrations and protests within Berlin, and will very much probably kind of
be targeted and slandered for that work. So definitely keep an eye out on them, share their work, and uplift those that are victims to this slander.
Hebh Jamal, thank you very much for sharing your insights and experiences with Connections. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you so much once again for having me.